What did you set out as the priorities when you first stepped into the role?
Well, probably in the short term, Andrew, obviously we're looking to appoint a national team manager, and that's a key appointment for the association. So that's one of my short-term objectives, to work alongside the association on that. Also the launch of the strategy, it will be coming out in the next few months, and that's been a significant piece of work. And also getting people back on a football pitch and supporting that return to football for all of the girls and women's teams in the country. So that's the sort of short term, next 2 to 3 months. And then beyond that, my objectives will all be around the strategy, in terms of the objectives within that strategy, and trying to progress along some of them over the next 12 months.
How do you feel the process of finding that new manager is going?
It's going really well, Andrew. It's fair to say it started pretty much as soon as Shelley had left the post back at the end of last year. I've obviously come in more recently, so there was a lot of work done in the last few months. I've picked up with Andy Gould, who's the new Chief Football Officer, as well as Ian Maxwell, and we're trying to progress that along. Something that we're all absolutely agreed on is it's a really important and key appointment for the association, so it's one we want to get right. We're trying to cast our net far and wide to ensure that we get the best calibre of candidates possible. And importantly, we want someone to come in that can take us back to major tournaments, because that's where we think that team belongs. So in terms of the process, the last few months we've been accepting applications. We'll continue to do that for another few weeks, but we've also been proactively trying to identify other candidates that fit the profile. And again, people that we think can take us back to major tournaments. In a few weeks' time, we'll start to refine that sort of long list into a shorter list with a view to appointing. In an ideal world, we'll get them in for June, which is the next international window. But the main thing is that we get the right person and that they're in post for those qualifiers in September.
Having spoken to a few managers from the women's game in Scotland, a common theme seems to be that the fact that they feel there's maybe not enough voices in high positions in Scottish football, whether that's at board level, the areas where decisions are being made. What's your stance on that, and is that something that you're looking to work on as well?
Yeah, definitely, and I can understand that position, having previously been in a SWF and worked really closely with the clubs. It's fair to say that it's something that's been called out in the strategy, and there's a particular pillar within the strategy on governance and representation, and a commitment from the association to look at that representation and improve it for the girls and women's game. I think sometimes we have to reflect back to understand how we've got here. And if I look back at my own time, I came in as a volunteer in 2014. And at that point, there were no professional players in the game. There were no real broadcast contracts or commercial contracts. Fast forward to where we are now, and we've got, nearly 40 professional players, 30 internationals in the league. Just look at the profile of the game of last weekend in terms of the broadcast and live streaming coverage, along with those commercial sponsors. So we've quickly evolved into a far more professional environment. And in my view, the governance hasn't evolved as quickly as the game has. And that's something that we're looking to address. And I've already had meetings with the quality, David McArdle, the qualities department, to look as to how we go about doing that. And that's something that will be one of my objectives over the next 12 months as well.
Fiona, how are you doing? Hope you're well. Listening to your interview with the SFA just before you came out, you mentioned about the funding that you SFA got from UEFA, the 350,000. Can I ask how the association broke that down and how they decided what went where?
Yeah, so Ronnie, first of all, so it was £350,000. £50,000 of that was committed to SWF, and they can choose to distribute that how they see fit. And my understanding is that that's largely to get the Premier League One back and to support the additional costs of COVID. A similar sum will be retained for the performance programmes. So the youth national teams and the youth performance programmes, such as regional squads, we're going to try and get some enhanced activity for them over the next 2 or 3 months, recognising that they, like a lot of other players, have lost essentially 12 months of contact time. The rest of that money, which is around 2/3 of it, will go out directly to clubs via grants. And that's something that we're hopeful we're able to communicate the details on that fairly soon. But essentially that money is going to be invested into grassroots and all of football to try and help and encourage the clubs to get back on a football pitch. And we'll be looking for them to try and put on some new activities, some extra activities, some free activities, so we can get girls and women back on a football pitch. And I guess the rationale behind it, Ronnie, is that a small amount is going into that performance environment through SWF and through performance, but we need to recognise that there's about 200 clubs, 700 teams across women's football, and we need to ensure that money is spread across the entire game, from the grassroots side right up to the more performance side.
Can you understand the frustration of those clubs within the top league who are playing at the moment, who say that simply £50,000 isn't enough, that they need more money in order to help battle COVID if they want to see out the season?
Yeah, Ronnie, of course I can understand that. I've worked really closely with those clubs over the past 3 years. So I guess if you look at the funding distribution over the past 12 months, Premier League 1 and Premier League 2 benefited from James Anderson funding. The Championship benefited from the anonymous donor. Those 3 leagues and the clubs within it all benefited then from the government distribution in terms of the money that was designed to offset spectator losses. So they've already had a significant sum, and it's important that we don't forget about the rest of the game. So those clubs, as part of that performance pyramid, can also apply for these grants, but it's important that they're also open to the grassroots and the other elements in the game. So that's the rationale, is that there has been some support already for those performance clubs. We recognise their costs are higher, so they are welcome to apply for these additional grants to the UEFA funding. But it's also important that we let other parts of the game access the support that they need to ensure that we've got that pathway of youth and young players coming back through as well.
Because as you were mentioning about representation and higher voices and whatnot, I mean, the clubs have spoken to us in the last couple of weeks saying that there is a shortfall there between the highest within the leagues in terms of affording the testing that they need to see out the season. I imagine it's the SFA's goal that if they can ensure the men's league is well financed enough to afford testing, they should also do the same for the women. I think they need more money. They can only see out the next 6 games probably if the testing finance package is as is. So I imagine it's a concern of the SFA that the sporting integrity of the women's game, the season may not finish if they don't have enough money.
Yeah, of course. And as somebody that's worked at SWF and closely with those clubs in the Premier League, it's our ambition, of course, to get those leagues completed. And not just Premier League 1, we want to see Premier League 2 back as well. The Championship's in a little bit more of a difficult position because it was never under that professional exemption. So they never managed to get going. But I think those top 2 leagues in particular are keen to support and ensure that they do get back. Obviously, a lot will depend on the government route map. It feels like in May, 17th of May, I think it is, the adult contact sport will resume. What we don't know, we understand that that's likely to be without testing, but we don't quite know yet what the travel limitations will be if they're playing without testing. So we're working really closely with the Scottish Government to try and ensure that the Premier League 1 and 2 can continue without testing and they're able to travel nationally. And that's something that we're continuing to support and in regular and daily dialogue with SWF to help support that.
Fiona, when you look at this strategy that you're going to publish, do you see this as being something that is short to medium term, you're wanting to really hit the ground running, or is it thinking 10 years into the future in terms of what you want to achieve?
Look, it's probably 4 to 5 years into the future, so that short to medium term, it's capitalising on where the game is now. And it's something we've never had before. We've never had one strategy for all of girls and women's football in Scotland. Up until now, we've had a commitment to girls and women's football strategically, but through other plans, so participation objectives contained within a general participation plan for the organisation. So this is the first time we've ever had that single strategy that includes not just the elements of the game that the Scottish FA are responsible for and run directly, but it's also included SWF and some clubs in that process as well. So it's very much about capitalising on where we are now. I think 2019 was a key year for us. We saw the impact of having a successful national team. We want to build on that. We want to really drive forward in terms of the performance leagues and the elite performance part of our game. So the strategy is really looking to enhance and raise the bar in terms of performance, but at the same time recognising that we want to continually grow the number of girls and women playing football. And the other part we've already alluded to is that representation and the visibility of women's football, both within the association, but also externally in the media, and making sure there's a spotlight and that girls and women's football is at the forefront of everyone's minds.
You see, in England, there's been a groundbreaking television deal with a variety of channels, and I know there's more exposure coming through in Scotland now as well. But what's the ambition in terms of growing the revenue and that? Because you look at the World Cup, the Euros, there was the exposure there for that time, but making sure it's consistent and prevalent a lot.
Yeah, the two things go hand in hand. Look, so we need to get more people watching girls and women's football. We need it to be more visible. And last weekend was a little bit of it was certainly an important moment for the game, because for the first time ever you could watch all of the Premier League One game live, whether that be on Alba, BBC Scotland, or through the club's own streaming channels, followed up with a really good highlights package done by BBC on Sports Scene. So once we continually want to enhance that visibility of the game, but in terms of having a long-term sustainable performance in professional league in Scotland, we want to drive the commercial revenues up as well, encourage more commercial partners to partner with the league and the association to drive more revenues into the clubs, because that revenue into the clubs helps them enhance the product on the pitch and the infrastructure that they've got around their women's section. So it all goes hand in hand, and it is pretty cyclical in terms of getting that investment into the clubs to enhance the product, which encourages both the commercial sponsors and the broadcasters to engage with us.
What's the view then? Is there a potential, do you feel, if you're able to do that and implement the strategy, that full-time clubs or some full-time clubs, a hybrid, could happen in the next 4 to 5 years?
I think so. Look, that has to be the ambition. If we look at some of the clubs in the league already, Rangers have gone there. They are that full-time professional, and they've wrapped all the resource of the football club around their women's section, and you can see they're beginning to reap the rewards of that. Glasgow City have traditionally been the trailblazers, and they've got mostly professional full-time players in a slight hybrid model. Celtic similarly have got an increasing number of professional players. So we're seeing that as the direction of travel. The discussions I'm having with the clubs in the Premier League 1 and 2, and even some of the ambitious ones down in the Championship, they're certainly looking to bring their women's sections closer into their football departments. I think that's really important, because that's where we'll drive that professionalism on the pitch, and it's undoubtedly got to be our ambition to have that professional league and performance environment in Scotland, so that the young girls growing up can dream of being a professional footballer and they don't need to leave the country to do it.
How key is that kind of link up with the men's or the club as a whole? We know Birmingham were kind of complaining in terms of the budget cuts were impacting on the women's game and not as much the men's. How key is that link now? We see it a lot, but in terms of going forward, to make sure that when times do get tough, that it's an all-in-one sort of resolution that they come up with.
It's really important. Look, there's not one model that works, because we do have some really successful independent clubs in this country, and we need to be respectful of that and understand that they've found a way to be successful without that sort of men's club being around them. But I think if you're a women's football club right now and you're part of a wider football club that has a men's section, I would 100% encourage them to bring their women's section in as close as they can, so that they've got access to the infrastructure that football club has, and in particular the performance environment that they can create for the players, because for me that is how we're going to enhance the standard of the competition. It's how we're going to improve the governance. It's how we're going to improve the credibility of the game. So it's really important, and I think I'm certainly seeing some really positive steps and having encouraging conversations with clubs, so I'm really hopeful that we're beginning to see some progress in that area.
Fiona, can I just ask you about we had an interview recently with Laura Montgomery, who said she felt that the momentum from qualifying for the World Cup had been kind of lost just because the domestic women's game had just stopped with the pandemic. Do you feel that you're having to catch up on what has been achieved coming into this role now, that was frustrating, that women's football seemed to suffer more than men's? Yeah,
there was nobody more frustrated than me than when we had to stop playing. I think if we cast back to the sort of league launch of 2020, which is around about February time, we were all speaking about it being potentially one of the most exciting seasons we'd ever seen in the Women's Premier League. And then obviously the pandemic hit and we did lose that momentum, as did a lot of football and other leagues. Encouragingly, what we're seeing, we've obviously got the Women's Premier League back, and post-pandemic we'll actually have more visibility than ever in terms of the broadcast and the coverage. But importantly for me, what we're also seeing, we've surveyed the clubs, and around 70-75% are saying they haven't lost numbers, and some of them have actually increased in their numbers. So there's encouraging signs that although we've seen a really acute short-term impact, that we can recover quickly, because we can pick up on that momentum that we had from the World Cup. And the sort of recent developments in the domestic leagues certainly help that, because it keeps the women's game at the forefront of people's minds.
And on the subject of representation and decision-making bodies, I mean, have you had encouragement from people you've spoken to at the Scottish FA that can be done quickly? Because if you look at the board, the professional game board, obviously there's a lack of representation there for the women's game.
Yeah, there's definitely a commitment, and that's called out within the strategy, that we recognise we need to review that representation. So you've referenced to the non-professional game board and the professional game board. As I said earlier, if you go back to maybe 2014, representation on the non-professional game board made sense because the entire women's game was non-professional. The game has evolved, so we do need to look at now where it is represented, whether that's on the professional game board. We see other countries have things like women's football committees as well. So we need to examine the different models and make sure that we get it right. And that's something I've certainly had a lot of encouragement as a commitment from the association to do that. So that's something that I'm going to take forward pretty soon within this calendar year.
Thank you.
Fiona, sorry to just on the appointment of the national team, is it important for the association that that's a woman?
Not necessarily, Ronnie. I think, as I said earlier, it's the most important thing is we get the best person for the job, the person with the skills, the expertise and the experience. Importantly, somebody that shares our ambition, because we know we've got a really talented group of players. We need somebody that can take that talented group of players and get them performing at the levels we know they're capable of. I know they're really ambitious to get back to major tournaments. So for us, it's not important if it's male or female. It's absolutely just about getting the right person to take us forward.
The only reason I ask is because obviously you look at Glasgow City, Rangers, Celtic, and maybe Scotland. All the top teams would be run by men. Is that something is that an image problem, or is that just something that goes with the territory of if the footballing is getting better, then they hire the best people for?
I think for me, we've got a commitment to try and encourage female coaches, female referees, female leaders, and that's something again that we're going to address within the strategy. Is how do we wrap around those coaches of potential and try and help them make it into the top league? At the moment, I think we've got Debbie McCulloch in Premier League 1, Emma Hunter in Premier League 2. We do have really talented female coaches within the game, but it's how we encourage more of them. But it's not just at coaching level. I think that's the same in match officials. We have seen an increase, but we want more female officials in the same way as we want more coaches across the game that are female. We need to find ways to make it as easy as possible for females to become engaged and stay engaged in football. So that's something that was, again, is a commitment to within the strategy.